All right, hi ladies and gentlemen, this is Mr. Peoples here again. In this particular screencast, we're going to talk about the D-Day Invasion, the war in Europe and North Africa. And so your learning target today is I can describe the impact of the D-Day Invasion. So after the United States is attacked at Pearl Harbor by the Japanese, the United States declares war against Japan. A couple days later, Germany declares war on the United States. And the United States is officially in World War II. President Roosevelt and the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill meet to develop the Allied plan. And the picture you see right here shows them meeting together. And they both agreed that the priority was to defeat the Germans. Remember, at this time, Hitler had taken over all of Europe. Britain, the island country of Britain, was standing alone against Germany, and the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front is taking on the Germans, their full force. And so Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, wanted the Allies to attack in the West to take some pressure off of Russia in the East. This would force Hitler to move troops over to the West so that it would make it easier for the Russians to fight in the East. But both Churchill and Roosevelt believed that trying to do that would be a disaster for the Allies because the Germans had built up their defenses so much in France that they thought that the untrained American troops now being forced into this fight wouldn't be ready for a battle like that. So they put their focus on attacking in North Africa, where the Germans had taken control of countries like Tunisia and Madagascar and some of the not Madagascar, excuse me, Tunisia and some of those northern countries there of Africa. Some new technologies in the war: sonar, which was a technology that used sound waves to detect underwater objects. So submarines were more easily detected using this sonar, and so then the ships could use depth charges to try and destroy them. And then the use of long-range bombers, airplanes that were built to fly a long distance and drop their bombs. This allowed the Allies to fly from places in Britain and drop bombs on German factories, railroads, and cities. And this was an important new technology for the war. All right, let's talk about North Africa. In 1942, the German Afrika Korps, led by Erwin Rommel, began the North Africa offensive against Egypt. The British had been fighting the Germans in North Africa from the east, and the United States and the rest of British forces were going to attack into the west of North Africa. And matter of fact, let me show you what this looked like. I'll put on this animation. Hopefully it'll come up here for us. Okay, so here's a map of Europe. You can see the Germans and Italians have taken over most of the continent. And you can see down here in Africa, the French government that was left moved to its colonies down here in northern Africa. Well, Hitler and Germany had their sights set on that part of the world, and so he started to put troops here into this area. The United States and Britain decided that this would be the best way into Europe, rather than attacking here in France, where the German defenses were very strong. The British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Franklin Roosevelt believed that going to Italy first and coming into Europe through Italy was the best way to attack the Axis powers. Matter of fact, Winston Churchill called Italy the soft underbelly of the Axis powers, making a reference to dragons and their weak spot that they have in their belly. And so the United States and Britain launched attacks, invasions in North Africa, and they weren't very successful. And that was good. The American troops needed to encounter some of those challenges so they could learn from those mistakes to prepare for the invasion of Europe. But as they move closer there. They take over North Africa. They fight the Germans in North Africa at a battle called the Battle of El Alamein. And then eventually they push the Germans off of the continent of Africa. And you'll see that here as the animation continues. Okay, so the Germans are pushed off of North Africa. Then the Allies attack into Italy. First in Sicily, and then eventually into the actual mainland of Italy. Now the United States and British troops are led by General Dwight D. Eisenhower. And the Allied troops advance from Morocco and Algeria to defeat the Germans. In July of 1943, the Allies attack or invade Sicily and head into the mainland of Italy. Slowly, the Allies move north along the western coast. And by June of 1944, the Allied forces capture Rome. It wasn't easy. Matter of fact, I'm going to show in this animation. They take Italy, and then they make their way up through Italy. They get to a point where they get stuck. And you can kind of see the line right here. They get to this line. It's outside of a town called Monte Cassino. And that is where some of the heaviest fighting in Italy took place, was in this Battle of Monte Cassino. Eventually, the Allies are able to push through and eventually make their way to Rome. But it was very difficult to do that. There you can see the line that was dug for the Battle of Monte Cassino. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, you can see, is starting to gain back land and starting to fight back against the Russians, because the Germans now have to fight on both sides, once against on the side against Russia, and they're having to fight now in Italy. Okay. By 1945, the Germans were driven out of Italy, and the Italian leader, Benito Mussolini, had been executed by Italian freedom fighters. Okay, so the Allied invasion of Europe starts in Italy, and this is just a practice run for what's going to end up being the D-Day invasion. And that's what we're going to talk about next year. I do want to show you a couple pictures. There's Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike was his nickname. He is the guy, the United States general, in charge of all forces in Europe. Okay. You saw in the animation, you saw the Russians coming back against the Germans. One of the turning point battles on the Russian front was the Battle of Stalingrad. German and Soviet armies battled in that front very viciously. In the Battle of Stalingrad, the fighting was street fighting, building to building, house to house. The Russian civilians were fighting against the German soldiers. Eventually, the Germans are surrounded by the civilians and the Russian army, and the German supplies begin to run low. The German commander asks Hitler for more supplies. Hitler tells the German commander, no, you can't get any more supplies. You should have already defeated these Russians, and he refuses that. Well, the German commander has no supplies. Eventually, it runs low, and the German commander has to surrender. He eventually surrenders. It's a huge loss for the Russians, and this happens in January of 1943. It was a major victory, but it came at a large cost. More than 1 million Soviet soldiers dead, almost 1 million Axis soldiers killed in this particular battle, the Battle of Stalingrad. The reason that the Germans were there is Stalingrad was a gateway to the oil fields of the Middle East. And so Hitler needed to get to Stalingrad so that he could have access to those oil fields in the Middle East, but that was unsuccessful. So you have a couple of these losses. The Battle of Britain is the first major loss for the German army, the Battle of Stalingrad, and the Allies are now starting to push in through Italy. And so by 1943, Germany is starting to have difficulties fighting against the Allied forces. And that leads us to the invasion of German-occupied France, or better known as the D-Day invasion. This is the first step toward freeing Europe and forcing Hitler to surrender. Dwight Eisenhower spent months planning this invasion. It officially started on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, or Designated Day. It involved American, British, and Canadian troops invading the coast of France from Great Britain. Americans were assigned 2 beaches. Their code names were Utah and Omaha. There was fierce fighting all along the Normandy beaches. That's the area of France where this attack happened. Almost 3,000 soldiers alone were killed or wounded at Omaha Beach, one of the United States one of the United States beaches they were responsible for. But by the end of the day, all 5 of those Normandy beaches were secured by the Allies, and Allies began moving east toward Germany. More importantly, supplies and troops were pouring into the continent that could be used to fight against Hitler. And so I want to show you a couple of things, because this invasion is a very interesting invasion. First, this is the area of France. Right in this area is the area known as Normandy. And the Germans believed that if an attack was going to happen, the attack was going to come from Britain right here at Dover to a town called Calais. So the Germans had built up their defenses all along the coast, but they made it very strong right here at Calais because they thought that was where the attack was going to happen. Dwight Eisenhower let the Germans think that. He put his best general, General Patton, in Dover and told all the newspapers about it so that the Germans would know that Patton was in Dover. Hollywood movie producers had set makers create fake tanks and fake planes so that when German airplanes flew over, it looked like they were seeing the Allies building up their military, when in reality the Allies were poised to launch their attack from here across the widest part of the channel. It's also the most risky plan, and so it caught the Germans off guard. Here you can see it's started with 3 phases. The first phase were paratroopers, soldiers dropped into enemy lines by parachute. That was the first phase. The second phase was the ships were going to, airplanes were going to drop bombs on the beach to try and create foxholes for the soldiers. And then the third phase of the invasion was actually landing troops on the beaches. Here you can see the code-named beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. The United States was in charge of these 2 beaches, and these 2 beaches were the more difficult beaches to take. The Germans had the strongest defenses here. And Omaha Beach, like I said before, over 3,000 people were killed just trying to take that one beach. It was very difficult to do. The paratroopers in the first phase, many of them were dropped in the wrong places, and so they had to kind of reassemble and find themselves. And so those were some of the difficulties with the D-Day plan. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in class. Here you can see some of the pictures. This is later in the day on D-Day. You can see the ships used to bring soldiers in. The reason I say this is later in the day is because you can see the balloons here. These balloons were called barrage balloons, and they're an indicator that the Allies have taken control of this beach, because you would put those up to prevent airplanes from flying down low and shooting at you. And so you can see there's the soldiers aren't rushing in. It looks like they're walking in. So this picture indicates a beach that has been taken. Now on this picture, here's one that's a little bit more in action. You can see soldiers rushing to the shore. You can see materials and things all in the water there along the beach. This is a beach that is currently, this is during the attack. And then this is a very famous photograph of Omaha Beach. And I want to point out a couple things. Here's the beach. You can see the beach right here, but in the distance, look at the hills that the Allies, especially the United States forces here on this beach, look at the hills the U.S. forces had to climb up to get past this beach. And so not only did they have to get through the beach where everyone's shooting at them and there's landmines and all kinds of other things, but then they have to climb that hill to get to the German defenses. Very difficult situation. This is a letter that Dwight Eisenhower gave to all of the soldiers before the attack. You can pause it and read it if you'd like. On the left side is the draft of it, and on the right side is the finished copy. And then this is a little handwritten note that Eisenhower would have given to the newspapers, or would have spoke at a news conference had the invasion failed. And what's interesting about it, in the first sentence, he takes blame for, actually not the first sentence, but the last sentence. If any blame to attempt, it is mine alone. So he takes blame if the invasion failed. Thankfully, he didn't have to release this. Here you can see paratroopers falling or dropping from the planes, falling to the ground. And there's a very famous story about the town of San Mary-Glise, where a paratrooper got caught in the church steeple and watched as the rest of his paratroopers came down in the middle of this town where the Germans were firing at them as they came down. This guy hung from the steeple and watched his fellow soldiers be killed as they fell. Today there's a monument to that soldier still there, and so the picture you see here is a picture of the monument. There's not a real person up there. It's a mannequin to represent that person, that soldier, and the rest of the Allied forces who died trying to take that town and free that town from German control. So D-Day is the beginning of the end for the German army. It is the beginning of the end of World War II. That's one of the reasons why it's so important. Another reason, it's the largest invasion in world history, largest amphibious invasion, that means by sea, in world history. And so those are two main reasons why D-Day is important. So your learning target is, I can describe the impact of the Allied invasion of Europe. There's two impacts right there. All right, we'll talk next about the war in the Pacific. Thank you very much.